Okay, guys, I think we're going to start. Thanks so much, everybody, for coming tonight. We're really excited to have Chris Lilley talking to us about WebFonts. And I just want to cover a couple things before we start. The pizza is like gone, so you guys found that. And then there's, which is great, and wine and beer and soda, and there's water on the other side of the refrigerator. And we have bathrooms in the back of the room. There's another one on the first floor if you need it. And ask me if you have any questions about anything. I'll be around. I think that's all of the things I have to cover. Oh, Vermonster has sponsored our meetup tonight, so thank you so much to Vermonster. And I think that's it. We'll have a time for announcements if anybody wants to announce anything at the end. And that's it. Have fun. Enjoy.
Okay, is this thing on? Can people hear me? Is it amplified adequately? Good. Okay, so I'm going to be talking to you today about WebFonts. I guess everyone here uses WebFonts, right? Is there anyone that creates websites and doesn't use WebFonts? That's what I thought. Is anyone that's just not listening? No, good. Okay. So this is me, as you probably gathered. I work for W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium. I'm a technical director. I should update the slides because there isn't an interaction domain anymore. I started SVG. It's one of the things I did. Co-authored PNG. I was the first CSS working group chair, and I'm currently editing CSS4 color, which I won't talk about today. More relevant to this, WebFonts. I chaired the first group that actually produced that font face. I was also involved in WAF1, WAF2, and more recently chromatic fonts, which you will hear about later. So what are we going to talk about today? Firstly, some basics, make sure we're on the same page. Then I'm going to talk about OpenType features and CSS. Then a bit about performance, not too much, but a little. And lastly, the famous crystal ball gazing and predictions and what's hot and coming. So basics first. Okay, actually, do people know what that is and why it's backwards? Anyone? Yes. Someone, tell me what it is. Yes, it's for printing. That's right. So there is a character, which is a code point. It's a number, and it has some properties associated with it. And then there is a glyph, which is the visual representation of the character. So the thing that we just looked at, was that a character or a glyph? It was a glyph. That's right. Good. Yes, there will be questions, and there will be a quiz afterwards. So this, for example, is what? How many characters are there? How many glyphs are there? Yes. Hooray. Okay, next thing. How many characters is that? 1. Any other answers? Good. How many glyphs? How many fonts? 1, probably. Yes, it could be either 1 or 2 characters. If you have pre-composed, then it will be one character. And if you have a separate combining accent, it will be 2. It is 1 glyph, regardless of which way you do it. And it could potentially be from different fonts, which can give you really weird effects if you don't notice it. If you over-subsetted your font and then all your accents come from somewhere else, it looks hideous, trust me. So the next thing I'd like to talk about is what is a font face. That's a font family. Here's an example, Myriad Pro, that's a font family. And you can see that there are different faces within the family, a light, a Roman, a bold, etc. Those are faces. Similar for Baskerville, it has several faces. Now, properties and descriptors. Have a look at this. You can see that there's a font weight, bold, twice on the screen. Why? Why is it there twice? Are they the same? Are they different? What? Can anyone tell me why to have it twice? It's fine if you just say don't know. No, good guess, actually, but no. Okay. Yes, the first one is defining what properties the font has, and the second one is requesting a font with particular properties, which will therefore match That's right. So the first lot, they're descriptors. They're things that describe what the font can do. And the next lot are properties. They're requests for a styling of a particular type. Descriptors, so yeah, I've just said that. So the other thing is, of course, you don't just ever ask for a single font. You ask for a stack of fonts, right? Why do you do that? And what happens if you've got more than one? Well, you would say that the first font that exists is used. Not necessarily. The first font that exists and has glyphs for what you're actually trying to style is used. So here's a good example. If you have a Japanese font, so suppose you're trying to display a web page which has got Japanese and English in it. So you pick a Japanese font, and to your horror, all of the English text looks terrible. Absolutely terrible, because it was thrown in without much thought. We don't use those much. Here are some ugly glyphs. So what you can do with a font stack is you can put the nice Latin one first, and then the Japanese one afterwards, and therefore all the Latin letters get pulled from the Latin font. Great, wonderful. Now suppose that a few years later, the font designers are being a bit more international, and so they add a few Japanese characters to the Latin font, just a few. Now they get used, but you can't put them both first, right? You can't do that. What do you do? Any idea what you do? Subset would be certainly an answer. Kind of tedious, and you might not be allowed to by a font license, but it is an answer. There are other answers. Unicode range is a descriptor to say which Unicode characters you can use. It doesn't say the font has them all, right? Because the default is the entire Unicode. That's the default value. But what it says is actually don't use the ones outside the range I've specified. So you can use this to your advantage. So here's an example. We have got some Japanese font, and you have, what do you mean? Go away. Aha. So we have a lovely piece of syntax there, Unicode range, U plus A5, U plus 4000, etc. As you can tell, obviously, that is the yen symbol, followed by kanji, followed by katakana, followed by hiragana. As you can tell, obviously, from the numbers. So at this point, I have a ritualized confession to make. I'm really sorry. I invented this syntax. It's total shit. Sorry, it's been there for 18 years now, and there's nothing we can do with it. Actually, we're considering adding new things to it, which is script ranges. So you would actually just be able to say, Japanese, and it figures out what numbers those mean. So that would be good. So here's an example. We have a heading there, and we've got a nice little swash ampersand, which looks pretty. And of course, we believe in the separation of content and presentation, so we have not put a special little span around our ampersand. How do we do that? We use the Unicode range. Just that. The character with code 26 is the ampersand. Let's look at that in practice. So I'm going to go U plus, thank you. U plus 26. And nothing happens. Why? Because I haven't actually used that in my font stack yet. So let's do that. Ding! And if I get rid of the Unicode range, then it applies to everything. But if I don't have that, then it just applies to the ampersand. No subsetting needed. In your own CSS, you can actually control which parts of which fonts are used where. And if you look at the source code, the source for this, you can see there is no span around the ampersand. OK. So now we've got the basics down. Let's look at OpenType features. So how many of you do any sort of desktop publishing or anything like that for print? Any of you? So you're using like InDesign and stuff like that, and you're used to using OpenType features and having these drop downs, and you can select all this stuff. And then you come to the web, and it's like, where did it go? Why can't I use this? Well, you can, kind of, and it's starting to get there. So here's an example. This is using some fancy Unicode features. Sorry, OpenType features. You can see we've got little CA ligatures and all sorts of stuff like that, and swash forms and fancy things. So OpenType is a font format, and it has all these fancy features in it. These are stylistic controls, and then the idea is that CSS gives you the knobs with which you turn these controls. Fonts vary in the terms of what features they have. You have to actually play with the fonts and look, or hopefully read the documentation. But as anyone here who codes knows, documentation is always the last job just before the next job arrives from the next client, so it never really happens. So there are two ways to get at this. Font variant is the correct way. It's the preferred way. It has nice human readable syntax. It's also supported in Firefox, and Firefox? What? What is happening now? Give it a wiggle. Could I, yeah, actually, can I get a power adapter? Maybe it's not happy about this. Where's my, where did I put my, where's my bag? There we are. Sorry about this, folks. Of course, all of this worked perfectly when I was going through the demo about an hour and a half ago. Thanks. I don't know if that's what it is, but yeah, have you tried switching it off and on again? Huh, wow. Seriously, it has actually rebooted. It just randomly rebooted. Oh, no, it didn't. It just shut down. Okay, winding back. Shut up. He's not my boss anymore. I can tell him to shut up. So font variant has got really poor support, but it has a meaningful syntax that you can understand. And then there's a low-level thing which uses cryptic little four-letter codes, which you have to understand the OpenType spec to know what they mean, and you have to apply them in particular orders and with particular values, and it's a pain in the ass. And that works everywhere. Both of these links go to Can I Use, and on Can I Use, you can use it everywhere except Opera Mini, i.e. the usual situation. But I'm going to use the readable one because I have faith, misguidedly, I have faith that the other browsers will catch up. Actually, Safari has caught up on that to an extent. Yeah, Safari has. If anyone's here from Microsoft, get your act together. Microsoft, by the way, was one of the two companies that actually produced the OpenType spec, so you would think they would kind of be on top of actually supporting OpenType in the browser that they make. But hey, you know. So let's look at this. There's two lines of text here, and as you can see, for the ones with uppercase, the characters line up nicely, the numbers line up, and it all looks good. And for the bottom ones, well, I guess we're used to seeing that, but actually that's not very good, is it? Because lowercase letters, we've got ascenders and descenders, and it'd be nice if the numbers had that as well. And maybe the font does have that. So using the font variant numeric property like this, I can change it from the default value of lining numbers to old style numbers, and now the lowercase ones match. Obviously, you wouldn't actually do it like that. You would apply it on different spans, depending on whether your headings are uppercase or lowercase or whatever it was. But you have control over that with just one property. So that's nice and pretty. Another thing, fractions. Obviously, most fonts have got like a half or a 3/4 or something like that, but they're not going to have a 13/27 built in as a standard fraction. But if you set font variant numeric to diagonal fractions, then boing, suddenly these magically turn into fractions, just by the fact that it's like, there's a number and a slash and another number. Okay, these are fractions, thank you. Whoop. And they magically become fractions. Here's another example. There's a column of numbers there, and you can see that one of them starts with an 8, and one of them with a 1, one of them with a 2. So probably the one that starts with 8 is the biggest number, right? Because actually, no, because it has less digits. They don't line up. Now, you could set this to a fixed width font, obviously. And then all your text would look terrible. So instead, what you do is you use a proportional font, but you tell it that you don't want proportional numbers. You want tabular numbers because you're using them in tables, and now they all line up. Again, one property, set that on your tables, and your numbers will look better. So here's another one, ligatures. So this, as you can see, has got ligatures. There's an FL ligature, that sort of thing. I can also switch on optional ligatures, discretionary ligatures. So now I've got the RO and the LE and that sort of thing is happening, and that's very nice. And lastly, there is a third value called none, and you can guess what that does. It switches them all off, including the ones you really should have on. Do not use this value, right? This value exists merely to make testing 50% longer than it should be, but actually, if the font is designed with ligatures, just use them. Use the ones that it provides by default. Unless, of course, you have a browser that switches ligatures off by default in the misguided belief that that somehow makes it faster, in which case you will want to explicitly set this to normal just to force it to do what it should have been doing in the first place. Thank you, Chrome. Okay, another thing, font synthesis. You may have found if you bring in just one font and then you ask for a bold and an italic, that magically these appear, right? You get a bolder thing and you get something that's at least slanted, if not italic. So what font synthesis property does is it says, I don't want you to synthesize italics. But you can synthesize weight. Or you can synthesize none of them. Now, this particular font already has a bold, so that's fine. But let's pick one that doesn't. Let's see. There we are. No? Oh, right. Yes, I remember now. Sorry, so I'm doing this in Firefox. So now I have to talk about a Firefox bug. I've selected all the other browsers. I'll select out this one. It always fakes up the bold, even if you tell it not to. But if you give it a font that has a bold, it doesn't do a fake skinny one. So that's fun. Okay, good. So anyway, you can control the weight and the italicness. Here's another one, font kerning. Do people know the difference between kerning and letter spacing? Yeah. Yes, good, excellent. So here's another. Kerning is a pair of characters, and the font designer decides that these ones need to be a bit wider or a bit closer together. Letter spacing is all of them, just shuffle them apart a bit because you've got more space to fill. So auto is the default value, and it means do whatever you do. This is a bad value, but it was introduced later in the life cycle of the web. So we always had to make the initial value be do what you do normally, so the web doesn't break. But actually what you want is normal, which here does nothing because Firefox, as it happens, applies font kerning, whereas some other browsers don't, Chrome. And therefore, if you set font kerning normal, you will force all of the browsers to do the same thing, to apply kerning. So this is a handy little one-line trick to make your sites more consistent from browser to browser. Because if you want kerning on, tell all the browsers to put kerning on. And if you want it off, of course, we've got you covered there too. With none, which, there you go. Now you can see it's wider apart. And this is different from letter spacing, which, whoa, what happened? There we are, it's letter spacing. You can go increase and decrease, and actually you can make it negative if you really want to. I suggest you don't do that either. All right, performance. So already people mentioned subsetting. If you have a huge big font and you know you've done an analysis of the website that you're styling for and there are certain ranges of characters that are not used, it does make sense to trim those out. As long as the font allows you to do that, some fonts do not. If you're using a font service, they will typically have tools that allow you to subset the fonts on the fly on their server. If you're using a Foundry or you're using open source fonts, they will also often, this is Font Squirrel, this particular one, they will typically give you some sort of GUI that lets you select which ranges you want. If you're doing it yourself by hand in Python or something, pay great attention because subsetting isn't as simple as you might think. You've got all these kern pairs that if you throw them away, that's going to look bad. You've got all these font variable things like glyph substitution, whatever, which are not much used in English, but they are used in other languages. And if you throw away those tables because you thought you could save a little bit of space, you will find much breakage. So subsetting is the first obvious thing you can do. WOF1. So WOF is a compression format for fonts. Actually, it's not just a compression format. It also adds some stuff. It adds some metadata, like the license file is over here at this URL, that sort of stuff. The reason we did that, by the way, was because we often found that there were free fonts available, and they came in a zip file with a README and a license.txt and the font. And the first thing people did was unzip them and stick the font on their web server. And then someone else would be reading through the CSS and go, oh, that's very nice. Oh, it's got this font here. I can download this. Where did it come from? Do I have to pay for it? Can I just use it? Will I get in trouble? And those files were never transferred across. So WAF allows you to not actually include it, but you can point to it. You can do useful things like that. So when you're snooping around someone else's CSS, which we all do, right? Then, which is fine. That's how the web was built. The view source principle is a good one. It means you can actually look into it and see if they bothered to put the link to the license in, of course. So here's an example. Here is a TrueType or OpenType font with a bunch of different tables. And we slap on a header and a directory, which points to the compressed tables. The directory, by the way, also tells you how big the original tables were before they compressed. So you could, when you decompress it, you know how much memory to allocate. And some metadata and optionally some private stuff. Don't worry about the private stuff. It really doesn't actually make any difference. Literally, it doesn't make any difference. There is a line in the WAF spec that says you are not allowed to change rendering based on the contents of the private block. If you do, you're in error. The font vendor can put stuff in there like a license key or whatever they want, but the browser is not allowed to check it or do anything with it. The browser is not allowed to be a policeman here. If someone steals someone else's fonts, that's a matter for their lawyers to talk about. The browser does not get involved. By the way, that's why WebFonts took off, and that's why they didn't take off for the first 15 years, because everyone was like worried about DRM and privacy and what should we do and etc. That was the difference there. So that's WAF 1. So WAF 2, yes, question. Yes, there is a table there called OS2. And it does, yes, it is related to the operating system, and it's still called that because that's how old it is. And it has some handy things like the Panos number and the Windows ascender, descender, and stuff like that. There's also a separate table called the head table, which has the Apple ascender and descender, which are different from the Windows ascender. And there's yet a third table, which has the typographic ascender and the typographic descender, which is operating system neutral, and everyone should use, and no one does. There, aren't you glad you asked? So in WAF 2, here's an example of some of the things we do, not just gzipping, but we look at each individual table, and there are certain things we can deduce. So this is the horizontal metrics table, or at least the information which is in it. It has an xmin, and an xmax, and a ymin, and a ymax. And if you look, xmin is the distance from the axis to here. And the left side bearing is the distance from here to here, and is always the same. Because OpenType fonts are designed for things to look at them in memory. They're designed for fast access. Sometimes they have duplicate information. Sometimes they have almost duplicate information. In this case, it really is a duplicate. So what we do is we throw all them away. All the left side bearings, gone. Makes it smaller. Then we can compress it. The glyph table, which is where the actual glyph data, the actual Bezier curves lives, it has all these different types of data. Some of them are like 16 bits, and some of them are 32 bits, and etc. So we split these into 7 different streams based on what type of data they are, and then compress a run of similar data together. So again, it compresses better. There's a locker table which tells you where each glyph starts in the table. We throw that away completely. When you're decompressing it, you're going to find that information anyway, so we just say recalculate that once you're decompressing the font. We're not even going to bother compressing that, just throw it away. So that, in summary, is WAF 2 compression. There's a WAF 2 header. There's a directory, as we had before. There's a collections thing, so you can actually use TrueType collections or OpenType collections, which is one font that shares data, so it looks like multiple fonts. That wasn't supported in WAF 1, and it is supported in WAF 2. It's also not supported in web browsers, but it will be. And we didn't want it to be, WAF can do all of these, oh, not those ones. We can't do those ones. So we made it, yes, with WAF 2, you can support all of the different OpenType features. And it uses a fancy compression scheme called Brockley, which is much better than gzip. When we brought in WAF 1, the browser vendors were a little bit hesitant. They were like, we're not sure that we really want a font-specific compression format. So what we did was, it's like, it's gzip. You've already got gzip. You need gzip for HTTP. You need gzip for PNG. So you've already got the library there. Don't worry about it. We get a good compression. Now, that fonts are used everywhere, people are like, can we make them smaller? Yeah, we can make them smaller. We can add a font-specific compression type. So we did, and that makes it even smaller. There we are. So how much smaller? If we take the uncompressed size to be 100%, then WAF1 will get you to around 45%. And WAF2 will get you down to 30%. So it's like a third of the normal size. By the way, the input data for this is the entire Google font corpus and the entire Adobe type library, and I think the monotype library as well. So it's a pretty large selection of data that we got those numbers from. So WAF2, if you're using true type glyphs, it gives you a compresses it down by 68%, which is better than WAF 1.0, 25% better than WAF 1.0 did. If you're using CFF glyphs, PostScript glyphs, it has less good compression. Why is that? It's because just the true type data is more compressible. We can crush it down more. Whereas the CFF table is actually quite well thought out, and it's just there's less work to do for the compressor. A word of warning, when we were doing our experiments, we also were aware that fonts are being used on mobile, sorry, I mustn't use the British pronunciation. And if you really grind down all the settings on the compression engine, you can get that last little bit of performance and you shave off 2% on the file size, and it takes twice as long to decode because the computational costs. And it's like, oh, that's a net loss, actually. So we've tuned it so that we're just before that point. So you don't have a sudden huge increase in CPU costs for decompression. The memory is much the same as WAF1, so that's not a big deal at all. Now, here's an example. Looking at the font, so you know these, are these properties or descriptors? What are they? Descriptors, yes, good. And what are these ones? Well, they're properties, right? But not CSS properties. These are JavaScript properties. So you can see there's again a one-to-one correspondence. What this is an API. This is loading the font, a font loading API. So once you've declared a font like that, then the next thing you do is you check whether it's loaded, and if it is, then you toggle a class to actually apply it. So you only apply it once you know it's been loaded. And if it doesn't get loaded, then that's fine. You'll use whatever fallback font you're using. Okay, the future. What should we talk about in the future? Why would I don't actually have a crystal ball? I'm just basing it on guesswork. So one of the things that has been lost from typography is color. As you all know, these illuminated manuscripts are very popular in the Middle Ages, and people have been clamoring to be able to do them again on vellum, well, on a screen, but with a vellum look, with the scent of vellum, and the monk, okay, that wasn't the reason. This was the reason. This is why we got colored fonts. Because the first time this got added, it was a bunch of crappy little bitmaps, and it's like, no, 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 please, let's have some nice vector things with color. Notice, by the way, we have multiple faces in different skin tones, so there's skin tone modifiers on emoji. We also have flags, and we also have circled letters. So little things like that, little combining things that say combine a circle with a letter and produce that. Okay, and this is actually an SVG font. How many people use SVG fonts? Why? Stop it, stop it. It was a short-term hack, right? The reason we had SVG fonts was because back in 2001, when there weren't smartphones, but when SVG was on phones, we found that the rendering engine had no access to the system fonts at all. And if it did have access, there was one font, the font. So if you wanted to have any sort of brand differentiation or any sort of, styling really, you had to provide the font with it. And what people did is they would design stuff in Illustrator, and then they would select all the text and they would go convert to curves, at which point they get exactly what it looks like and no text anymore and no way to search it with a search engine, and they would ship this over and say, it looks just like it did on my screen. Great, great. Or alternatively, they would say, I'm sure it'll look fine on the end system, and then they'd be bitterly disappointed. So SVG fonts was a way to say, convert these to curves, retain for each of these curves what letter they were originally attached to, done. Wrap those in a font tag, and that's it. right? It was a stopgap solution, and it went on way too long, mainly because Apple at one point, that was the only font format they supported for downloadable fonts. It has long gone away. When I said this was an SVG font, what I actually meant was, and I was trying to trick you, what I actually meant was an SVG and OpenType font, which I'm going to tell you about in about 2 minutes. So here's another one. This is rather nice, actually. I went to a typography conference, and there was a guy speaking about fonts, about type, actually, in India, where there is a tradition of hand-painted signage for things like fruit stalls and whatever, and people paint these huge, gloriously colored banners for a shop. And he talked to these guys because they're all getting old and they're being replaced by sort of vinyl printers and stuff. So he talked to them and says, I want you to design fonts for me. I want you to make fonts for me. And they're like, oh, we don't have computers. We don't have. So he says, fine, just draw them, and I'll do all the computer part. So they just drew them, and they presented him with huge rolls of cloth, painted brightly colored letters. And he's like, oh, you can't do that. And they're like, really? You got computers and all that stuff when you can't even do this? Of course, you can do it in print. I mean, here's an example there, the same typeface done. You could print that. It looks fine. Of course, it's not just one font. It's a bunch of layers lovingly aligned in Illustrator and printed out. This is not what we want. Instead, we want an editor, and this is an example. It's a free one, so I've just dropped it in. Take those fonts, export it out, and there we are. The new thing, color and CPAL are two new OpenType tables. Color holds the colored glyphs, and CPAL is a palette of colors. So each of the outlines is TrueType, and that's the result. So that is actually a color plus CPAL font being displayed in the browser with the colors all baked into the palette. Isn't that great? Is it not great? What's not great about it? Tell me what's not great about it. That was also a trick question. It's not great. Where did the styling go? We want to use a CSS to put the colors. We don't want to have the color baked into the font. And if we want to have different colors, we have to make the font again. That sucks. Stop being so overexcited. That was rubbish. This was rubbish. So here's another example. This is the SVG and OpenType thing. So now you have yet another OpenType table, which has basically a bunch of SVG in it. And the same palette, optionally, if you want. And then you use CSS variables to alter the palette. Woohoo! So now we have some SVG with some CSS variables lovingly sprinkled through it, and it looks like that. And that is an SVG and OpenType font being displayed in the browser as well. But now I can do things like change the colors. Like that. Isn't that a beautifully hideous combination? But assuming you actually get a designer to put the colors in, that means you can now override the colors from your CSS the way you should be. Good. So this was cool. OK, so that's not really future. I was displaying it in a browser. It works in Edge. It works in Firefox. And I guess Chrome will catch up. And maybe Safari, but, well. So now let's talk about CSS4. Basically, everything I've told you about so far has been CSS3 fonts. Now let's look at CSS4 fonts. So firstly, there is a new property called font palette. And what it does is it lets you select between the palettes that are in the font. Quite often, you'll have a dark and a light palette, right? So one set of colors for displaying on a white background and one on a black background. This lets you select between them. Okay, it's cool, it's nice. It's not that cool, it's just basic. This one is much more interesting, an at rule, which lets you override the palette. So you don't have to have special variables and whatever. You can just say, here's my at rule, here's my 20 colors that I'm using in my palette, go. And it does that. So that's much more useful. Font synthesis. So I already told you, I've already talked about this font synthesis thing. It's how you avoid getting fake bold and fake italic. Now we can avoid the fake small caps as well. Because if a font doesn't actually have small caps, what it will do is it will take a capital and shrink it down. But now it's too thin. It's not being designed like that. You're faking it. So what this means is, if I don't want that, if the font doesn't actually have small caps, don't use small caps, just use capitals. That's what you'll get. So that's, again, a handy thing. And new font families. So what are the basic font families? What are they? Serif, sans serif. Has anyone ever used Fantasy? Ever? For anything? Yeah, me neither. Really, seriously. System. Yeah, system was supposed to be what the OS uses. Yeah, okay, so there's serif and sans serif, and monospaced. Okay, and then two others that we pretend don't exist. Yeah, right, yes. I'll talk to you about system fonts in a bit, actually, because they're changing too. So there are some new ones. There's emoji, there's math. Some fonts are better at rendering math, like equations or whatever, than others. So if you put that as a fallback, it's like, okay, use this one. If you don't, use this one. And if not, then please give me a font that renders math correctly. Nice. And Fang Song is something for Chinese. Does anyone here speak Chinese? Nor me. Yes, you do. Do you know what that means, actually? Tell us. Kind of serif, but not really a serif. Okay, so that means you can put that at the end instead of serif, and that's apparently better. Are you happy about this one? Good. Excellent. Thank you. Okay, so here's a quick question, a little test for you. I love giving these little tests. It means I'm aware that the audience is awake. So we set font weight to 400, and then immediately we set font weight to calc 9 times 100. What do we get? What is the result? Is it 400 or is it 900? Which one? 400. Hands up for 400. Hands up for 900.
What browser are we in?
Haha. Hands, okay, assuming that the browser is implemented. Hands up for this is a trick question, Chris. We don't trust you yet. Yeah. Okay. Yes. In fact, this is a trick question because the result of calc 9 times 100 is a number, 900. But font weight doesn't take numbers. It takes little string-like things that don't have quotes around them, but are actually strings called 100 and 200. Can you believe it? CSS4 will change that. Font weight will be a number between 1 and 999, like it should have been forever. Why is that important? Because of what I'm going to tell you about next, which is variable font support. Variable fonts were announced about 6 weeks ago at the International Typography Conference in Warsaw. I was there. It was amazing. Everyone was really excited. Lots of code being rolled out all on the same day. Fonts being rolled out. People like Apple and Google saying, we have built this already into our OSs. It's going to be there in the next release, this sort of thing. What do variable fonts do? They let you change the weight or the width or the slant if it's an oblique font, or the optical sizing, or indeed any sort of custom axis that you as a font designer might want to put into your font. And they let you change that in a variable way continuously. Now, imagine if you're designing for print, right? So you don't care about the size of what you're producing as long as the printer can handle it. So you might use 5 different weights and a condensed and an expanded and whatever, and you multiply all those up and you've got 18 font files. And if you put those on a web page with 18 downloads, your users will hate you forever because they're just sitting there waiting for this stuff to download. It's terrible. Plus, you've still only got this range of weights, right? Suppose you want one in between. You're going to be tempted to add another one. Variable fonts, instead, what they do is they say, here is the master version. And then to make a thinner one, move this point here, move this point here, move this point. And to make a fatter one, move this point here and move this point here. So you can have an axis of variability, and you can, on the fly, generate anywhere along that axis.
This is Adobe Multiple Masters from the 90s.
This is like Adobe Multiple Masters from the 90s, except instead of interpolating between 2 masters, you have 1 master with some diffs, basically, which turns out to be smaller and turns out to be more numerically stable. It's also like TrueType GX, if people remember TrueType GX. Yeah, which was a really nice idea that was wildly under specified and didn't actually work on anything at the Mac because no one else could understand what the documentation said it was supposed to do. Basically, the new variable font stuff in OpenType 1.8 is both of those things rethought and made to properly work. And of course, you could animate them. Notice, so this one has an animated weight, and it also has an animated X height. You notice that the bold one is much a lower X height, and the thin one, it's got a higher X height. See, this is the two of them being animated at the same time. This, by the way, it's a GIF. It's a fake. It's not implemented in Firefox, which is what I'm using. It is implemented in Safari nightly, and as of a week or two ago, technology preview as well, on OS X only. On which was the version? 16. Yeah, 16. No, but the version of the OS.
Oh, macOS Sierra.
Sierra as well. I actually forced Leah to upgrade to Sierra this afternoon, so that I could take some of these demos on her Mac. So here's the idea. This font here has 3 axes, and you can see the range of variation on each one. There's a condensed and expanded, and there's weight and that sort of thing. The more I look at that, the more I'm not sure which of the axes is condensed and which one is something else. I mean, that one is clearly different from that one, but that, yeah, I couldn't actually find a better drawing than this. And I think it gives the idea, but don't spend too much time looking at it. So here we go. So here's a piece of the future right there. We have an at font face. And it says font weight 100, 900. Ooh. Does it do both of them? No. It does all of them between those numbers. It's like, here's the range of weights I can support with this one font. Woohoo. And font stretch. In other words, condensed. I'm sorry, again, poo emoji. Font stretch. I actually said, what should we call this thing that covers both condensed and expanded and whatever? What's the one name we can have as a descriptor that covers both of those? And there was a silence. And I said, OK, what about font stretch? I don't really like that as a name. Silence. Font stretch it is then in CSS2, font stretch. Later, when typographers got onto this, they're like, can we change this? No, it's been there. It's baked in forever. We did actually try to change it about 3 weeks ago. There was like, can we please change this? Let's change it to something else. Font dash width. No, it wouldn't fly. Like web compatibility, can't change it. Sorry. But at least now you can again say it has a range of values. 100% is the normal, 50% is the ultra condensed, 200% is the ultra stretched. Font style. Ooh, font style. Between -10 degrees and +40 degrees. What does that mean? That's the italic angle. Not italic, but the oblique angle. And yes, you can go backwards to make it turn the other way. And now we have this H1 using this. So we've set font weight to 234, thus showing it is a real number. Well, it's an integer, but you know what I mean. It's a real number. And we set font stretch to 80%, which it will compute for us on the fly. And we've set the font style to oblique, but we've also added this optional angle. I'd like my oblique to be at 24 degrees, please. And it says, OK, fine, I can make you one of those. And optical sizing, none. I was all excited when they had optical sizing, but if you look at the spec at the moment, it has 2 values. And those of you who know lots about CSS will guess what one of the values is. What is it? Auto. Yes. Do the mysterious magic thing that you already do. And the other one is switch it off. I would like to have more control than that. Feel free, the spec is on GitHub. Feel free to raise issues if there's things that you think are really broken and stupid.
What's the full backstory for font weight? Started to cool, and I use that to cool.
Right. Yes.
What do you do?
So you would need to look at the CSS3 spec, which will tell you it's an invalid value. But they are actually changing this to use the algorithm in CSS4 fonts, which does have a if it's not supported. So it takes that number and it finds what will it actually give me. And actually, if you downloaded that font, it will have a particular weight, which is the master, is the central value, probably 400. And you will probably get 400 because it will say, I want 234. It'll say, I've got exactly one weight for you. I've got 400. You'll get 400. That's the fallback story. The font will not actually go away, but you won't get the weight you asked for. Good question. Thank you.
Are these optical fonts, are they bigger? The master fonts?
The master fonts are a bit bigger, yes, but they're not bigger than 2 fonts. And also WAF2 does compress them already, even though they're new. The same mechanism still works. Remember I said that WAF2, we designed it so we could compress all OpenType fonts, including these. Yes. Yes. And really, you're going to have 2 fonts anyway, at least, right? A normal and a bold, that's your basic situation. So yeah, we're good. We're good. Except now you've got this whole range of condensed and everything. Not every font will offer that. You'll have to look at the particular font to see what it provides. So here's font variation. This is a really hideous syntax. So compared to that syntax, which is just, you know, very CSS-y, there is also this syntax where you look up the OpenType spec and you find WTH in quotes is the thing with which you control the width, and it takes a value between 0 and 1.4, I think. So 0.7 is about in the middle. Yeah, lovely. Why am I showing you this? Because this is the only syntax which you can actually use in Safari Technology Preview, because it's the easiest one. It's like, it's the most direct mapping to what's actually under the hood in the OpenType font. So you can play with it like that now, and you can hope fervently that they actually add the support for the more human-friendly readable versions, which are exactly equivalent, right? It's just, this is the low-level stuff. And of course, you can animate them. So you can animate the weights and this sort of thing like that, the usual way. And you can do pretty cool and weird, freaky stuff. This font has just 1 square, and it puts it together in various combinations. And so you get blinky, whoopy stuff. And this is, of course, a font. This is a font. All right. Well, this is a GIF, but you know what I mean. This is a GIF taken from Safari Technology Preview, where it was actually displaying live, and you could select it, and it really was text. By the way, at the end, these slides are online. They're on my GitHub, and I do actually have links to all of the fonts and the images, whatever, which I use. So if you want to play with them, they are there. Here's another example. So notice as this dollar sign gets heavier, there comes a point where that line in the middle is not working anymore. So they switch to an alternate glyph where it's just at the top and the bottom. That's using glyph substitution, which was already there. That's how in Arabic, when you get the initial form and the middle form and the final form for the same letter, depending on where it is in the word, that's how they switch between those. So it's the same thing here. It's just once the weight is beyond a certain point, switch to a different dollar sign shape. So you can do stuff like that. That's cool too. Now what's happening here? This thing is getting bolder and bolder, and it is taking up the same space because other things are being adjusted at the same time, so that no matter what the space, it always takes up the same. Imagine doing that the other way. You want to have a certain measure, a certain number of characters on a line, and as the width of the browser window gets smaller, you compress it up and you use a little bit more condensed things, so that essentially you're doing copy fitting. Think of not just I can get lots more weights and styles, but I can dynamically react to the environment, the browser setting, what sort of phone it's on, to copy fit this to a certain extent. And there's little cost to doing so. It's not like you have different downloads for all the different phones because they all have this special different font with a slightly more compressed. You just got the same one for everyone, and it just computes the appropriate. Jason Parmental, who wrote a nice book about typography in the web, said about a month ago, this may be the most significant development for design in the web since responsive design. And there's my credits and the web fonts used, and thank you. And my slides are on GitHub at that URL, and I hope that was interesting. Question, yes.
So where is the new thing in the CSS standards process?
Okay, so they were announced at A-Type I think 6 weeks ago. 2 weeks later, the CSS working group met in person and decided whether to add them to the CSS spec. And CSS3 fonts is like almost done, so we added it to CSS4 fonts. That spec has not been published officially, but you can actually read it. You can go to cssworkinggroup.org and you can see it in the drafts, the editor's draft. It's reasonably complete. And the person who got brought on as the co-editor, Miles from Apple, is also implementing it in Safari. That's why it's in there. So, and Google are pushing forward on this a lot because they think it's going to improve performance on mobile. So Adobe is converting their font library, because the thing is, a lot of fonts are actually made like this and then they get converted out, right? The actual designers are doing this interpolation thing anyway, and then they have to spit out all these individual files because that's the way you used to ship them. Basically, it's one less step for them in some ways. So there are fonts being produced now which are variable fonts. The Dunbar one I showed, for example, that's a commercially available font. You can buy it today. There are open source fonts as well. The browsers are starting to get there. The authoring tools are ramping up to produce the the new version of FontLab. Does anyone use type design tools, FontLab and stuff like that? So if I say the new version of FontLab, you'll laugh, right? Because there's been a new version of FontLab coming out for like 8 years. Well, I have actually seen it, and it does support this. So yes, we're getting there. Considering this was only 6 weeks ago that this was announced. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes. Yes. Okay. Okay, this is not a request for font subsetting. It's not sending that to the server and saying, make me a special font. It downloads the whole thing, and it just uses part of it. Mm-hmm.
So, do you have any recommendations for that for using Japanese fonts?
So, apparently there are different subsets of the glyphs which are appropriate to different reading levels. Right, so everyone that goes through primary school can read whatever it is, 2,000 characters. And then when they get to high school, they read some more and so on and so on. And then, academics who have made a special study of ancient Japanese literature can read millions or whatever it is. So sometimes people subset it that way. You can already do that. You can have, remember I said that the font stack, it's the first one that has the glyph. So it won't download the ones that are later on if it's already worked. So what you can do is you can make several subsets like that. And then once you hit the slightly rarer glyphs, it will download that one and so on. I also saw a very nice demo that Adobe did where they basically had a script that was running on the browser, talking to a server, and it was adding fonts on, well, it was requesting. It was like a byte range requests, pulling in more data as it needed it, and updating a font on the fly. So it was basically stuffing in glyphs as it came across the need for them, in batches, but it was actually extending that. The problem with that is that that works fine for one website, but as soon as you go to another website, that goes out of the cache and you've lost it again. So yes, there aren't all that good solutions for. Also, another thing with the SVG fonts that I showed you, the SVG and OpenType, because it's just SVG, you're not restricted to doing an outline. Okay, if you imagine a glyph that looks like this, you have to normally go all the way around the edges. But you could actually just say line, 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 line. And with SVG, you can do that. And quite a lot of Japanese glyphs can be described quite easily with strokes like that. And stroke fonts used to be kind of special purpose, but often they're designed like that, and then they're thickened up and given the weight, and they're exported as a normal font. So there is a possibility to use SVG fonts like that. That's the main things. You're not going to get away from it, right? You're going to need 20,000 glyphs, and there's no way to avoid shipping those at some point. The point is to not download them needlessly, really. I'm sorry, that's not a very great answer to your question, but I don't have the magic bullet, but that's some things you can try. Yes, Leah, you had a question?
Yeah, so you mentioned that if you manually subset fonts, then you should remember about like return tables and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So if you subset like 2 characters, if you remove 2 characters from the font, but they're in the kernel table, but if these 2 characters are next to each other, then this is returning. Is that still applied to the fallback font, or is it ignored?
No, it's not. It's only applied to that font.
Okay.
So it's Yes, yeah, that's fine. But yes, subsetting fonts is a problem. Now, I mentioned that all the different font services, or actually they have APIs, so you can request, as well as using a GUI or whatever, you can actually request through script that it make a particular subset for you. But if you're talking to Typekit, then you use the Typekit API. And if you're talking to Google Fonts, you use the Google Fonts API. And one idea that's been kicked around at the moment is that maybe we should standardize this, so there'll be one font subsetting API that all of the font foundries or the font services would support, so that you can then write your own scripts, which will, it doesn't matter whether you move from one font foundry to another or whatever, it would all work. There'd be a standardized API for doing safe subsetting that would not produce these sort of amateur mistakes that happen when you're trying to do it yourself.
What if it's only one character that's missing? Is the current table of that font still applied, or?
Current tables are not applied between fonts. So if I have this from font A and this from font B, then there's nothing that says that these should be kerned. They will not be kerned. Yeah, there's a question here. It's a little bit hard to do because it's browser internals that you're trying to change, which are really not accessible to you. So one of the things that W3C is doing is, I think, a project called Houdini, which is meant to, the reason it's called Houdini is because it's trying to take the magic out of, instead of this, oh, CSS is this big black box and you put stuff in and things come out, but you can't control what happens inside, trying to expose to you when the Paint API and the rendering API and this sort of thing. So CSS polyfills should be easier because of Houdini. Whether that will enable you to, one of the use cases, for example, was drop caps. Because if you want a drop cap that covers 3 lines, it's not just three M's, right? It's 3 M's minus the line spacing of one line. So doing that sort of calculation and finding out what the font metrics are and then producing it, that was the use case that we used for Houdini. It's like, would you be able, we're actually adding it as a feature to CSS, but if we hadn't, would you be able to do that sort of thing with Houdini? So polyfills for CSS will get easier over the next couple of years. Question in the back?
Similarly, polyfills, are there any of the features that can be reasonably supported through preprocessors?
Yeah, I know what you mean by preprocessor, but I'm trying to think how it would do that. No, not really, because the crucial feature for the variable fonts is that the one font file is basically making custom fonts for you on the fly. And that can't really be done using a preprocessor. Yeah, sure, it could find the nearest approximation. That's right. Or indeed, I guess, if you really cared about having lots of weights and you didn't much care about performance, you could say at supports, and if it supports this, then download this one font. And otherwise, you lose, and I'm going to download 18 fonts, and I'm going to give you the richness, but you're going to have to pay for it in download time. And I imagine that sort of thing would be easier with a preprocessor. You could define a macro that expands up to do that sort of thing. Yes?
What about font and conditional? Is it possible to apply terms and properties based on the font ability? Or is it possible to apply it on weight?
I have wanted that so much. I have had a font that wasn't available to me for whatever reason, and so I've gone to a fallback font, but now I need to change the weight a bit, or I need to change the line spacing a bit, or I need to make the size a little bit smaller because actually to give the same impression, it needs to be different. So using the font loading API, you can do that sort of thing. You can say if this loads, then put this other class on, and this class not only applies the font, but it also changes the size and whatever to make it look right. And one interesting thing that will work with variable fonts is, so the system fonts are becoming variable fonts. Like San Francisco on Apple will be a variable font. It already exists. So you'll be able to do fallbacks to system fonts where you also set it so that it looks as similar as possible in spacing and size and optical look as the actual font you're trying to download. So if the download fails for whatever reason, the user experience is as similar as you can make it with the default font.
So basically, to do that, we need a font media query. Like a media query that checks if the certain font is on the system.
Yes, that would be useful. Yes.
So,
Yeah, actually, the fonts you have installed in your system are probably one of the largest sources of fingerprinting. I remember I did one of these privacy query things, and it told me that there was exactly one person in the world that had the fonts installed that I had installed. Now, okay, the number of people who have AHEM font installed, which is something that CSS Working Group uses for testing, is probably quite small. But even so, it's a very high source of entropy that people can use for fingerprinting, just a list of fonts installed, which isn't normally exposed, but I think Flash exposes it for you, because Flash does that.
And even with CSS, you can set certain fonts so that they will measure it.
Yes, exactly. That's right. Yeah, you can already do this.
And,
Yeah.
and sure, it fingerprints that it's you at that point in time, but it's not you a month later. Because a month later, you will have installed even more fonts.
Well, you will, yeah.
I will.
Any more questions? Okay, well, thanks very much. I hope you enjoyed that. I really enjoyed giving the talk.
All right, thank you. So next month, we have Jen Kramer giving a talk on CSS grids. And in January, we'll have Alicia Sedlock talking about burnout. So we'll be hanging out here for a little while longer. If you have a little message that you want to give to the room about either like if your company is hiring or you're looking to be hired or you have a community event that you want to like share with everyone, you can like come along this way. Otherwise, there is a little bit of wine left, but we kind of blew through everything else. And we're going to be hanging out for a little bit. So stick around if you can. Yep.
Hello, all. So I'm a recruiter with Vitamin Talent, Vitamin T here in Boston. May have seen us, may have heard of us. We're at a lot of events. But if anybody is interested in chatting, or I have a couple business cards here, feel free to come up. We have a lot of development positions, front end and full stack. So yeah, thought I'd just do my part. Hello, I'm also going to talk about jobs. So I work at a web application consultancy called Dockyard, and we are looking for HTML, CSS specialists. You can visit our website, dockyard.com/careers for hiring, or you can explore the website for more information about our company, or just come up and talk to me about the position in the mingling. So, yeah.
All right, cool. See you next month.
Thank you. I'm glad you liked. Oh, I'm glad. I was really worried. Thank you. Good. I'm glad it came over okay.
Like everyone was more interested because like usually like when longer talks happen, like you can see people being like, let me check my phone.
Right,
but
right.
Everyone was like,
The only thing I would say,
Yes?
you should have candies like Vitali.
When they get an answer right, yes. Hey!